The popular classes are never winners in any of these processes. I think we need to keep that in mind. They were winners for a period in time only through the increase of employment, which enabled many families to have two income earners, and certainly that was a great deal better than what was going on in 1988. But generally, this was a period of time in which the rise and boom of the Celtic Tiger was also tied to a series of increasingly kind of neoliberalized Washington consensus-driven processes. Terry's talked about it, including privatization, including particularly the change in the tax regime, so that there was a massive fall in the amount of taxes paid by the rich. And we've really seen that more recently for people who have been following the kind of Wisconsin and U.S. model. I mean, it's a very similar kind of thing in the way Ireland has been a pioneer for the tea baggers in the United States. And the popular classes didn't participate centrally in the great boom and benefits, but they have been the sufferers from the various forms of crisis. So finally, let me just talk a little bit about then the link between growth and social welfare. This is probably where I go totally off the rails. The first thing I think which is interesting is to revisit the model that was put forward by Carl Polanyi in The Great Transformation and various other places, where he talks about a double movement. He refers mostly to the first neoliberalization regime of the 19th century, and says that as neoliberalism comes about and makes a number of attacks on the popular classes, the result of that is a counter-movement in which the popular classes push for something back in return. And of course then we have the rise of the welfare state and so on and so forth, the rise of some form of guaranteed medical care, etc. And that's kind of the overall story which Polanyi is taking. The question, I think, which is interesting to ask and to revisit, and especially in the context, not just of Wisconsin, Ohio, and Indiana, and the kinds of things that are happening in that part of the United States, in the context of what's even happening in Sweden, in the heart of kind of the Scandinavian model of social welfare, is the degree to which the double movement has come under attack through this latest phase of neoliberalism. And increasingly we're beginning to hear noises which sound as though the kind of outcome or goal of many in this crisis is not just to go back to the 70s or the 60s or the 50s, but to go back before the welfare state. And that's precisely the kind of pressure which is going on. And now, even in the Irish context, of course, we're hearing all of these calls for austerity programs, get the macroeconomics right, et cetera, et cetera. And as Paul Krugman said, it's like, well, we bled the patient, it didn't work, so let's just bleed him some more. And that's basically what it comes out to, but the result of that kind of a policy is one in which the double movement is under particular attack, that the possibility of provision of social welfare. And it's a challenge, I think, to various social movements to kind of reinstitute the pressures which will bring back a reinstitution of those things. I have here a thing where I have the Celtic Tiger, Mayan Jaguar. And that came from some work that I did with the Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico. In the early part of 2000s, between 2002 and 2006. And I lived for a period of time in Chiapas among the Zapatistas in a community where they were doing their thing. And I was really quite struck. I went kind of skeptical about what the Zapatistas were trying to do in Mexico. But I found myself among the people who were in an extremely impoverished area, who didn't really have the concept of a developmental state or a development model or a regime of accumulation, but who basically decided that we can in fact take control of our social economy and turn it around And what little resources we have, instead of chasing after this chimera of rapid economic growth, we can ask, what can we do for our people with what we have? And what they were able to do with very little resources was to create a healthcare system in which young women were no longer dying in such numbers in childbirth. They were able to create an educational system which had some relevance and meaning to young Mayan children who were able to speak their own language, to learn things that were of some relevance to their own society, and to develop themselves in a new kind of way. I mean, I even remember talking to one of the Zapatista leaders who was involved in education. And the kinds of things he was telling me sounded very much like Paulo Freire's alternative stuff in Brazil. And I said, well, I mean, I think I've heard this before. Isn't this Paulo Freire's model of education? Aren't you reinventing the wheel? And he said, yeah, maybe we are, but this is our wheel. And I think that was a very critical and important thing about what was being discovered in these very poor areas of Chiapas, was that a developmental model that doesn't take into account, first and foremost, the needs of the population is in real trouble. So that I argued very kind of crazily that the Mayans had a much better case, and this is in 2004, 2005, I was saying this, had a much better case for calling themselves by a cat name as a Mayan jaguar than the Irish did, a place which had such resources, such vast resources that flowed through this place between 1994 and recently, yet failed fundamentally to do the things which really needed to be done in order to make this what would be a truly rich nation, that is, to provide for the care of its people and primarily for their health, well-being, and their education. And when I say education, not to train them to be engineers for Dell, but to think about education in an alternative kind of way, which has more to do with some kind of real connection to what we want Ireland to be. So I would argue that there was a Mayan jaguar. To us it may not look like much, but it was more of a jaguar than this place was a tiger. And I'll leave to you to think about some of the alternatives.